Ladies and gentlemen, he is, of course, a professor of public policy, University of Birmingham, and the visiting professional fellow at the University of Oxford, UK. His presentation today has been titled as Globalization for Global Conquests. We know that we are a part of a global community, but likewise, our local strengths and opportunities are equally important. In our region only, we have seen countries turn around their economies in a single generation. How can Pakistan and other developing countries do that? How do we find and actually scale up our strengths and our opportunities, and what are these globalization opportunities like? So please join me in welcoming Professor Francis Davis for his address, for his presentation on Globalization for Global Conquests.
There is a story about an old UK Prime Minister who once stood up in a hall when he was out campaigning, and he shouted, "Can you hear me at the back?" And someone said, "Yes, but I don't mind changing with someone that can't," right? So we don't want to go there today, but we're going to talk about this subject of global conquest. It's not about war. It's not about conflict in that sense, and I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. It's about how we can unlock all of the unsweated talent, the unique talent, all of the assets that we have available to us. Got no slides. I'm going to need some slides. Here we go. It's about how we can unlock all of the talent and unsweated assets that we have available to us that sometimes we don't think are available to us, and how some new models in governance and collaboration between and at the interfaces of government, civil society and business are unlocking new values and new niches and new sectors. Now, the place I'm going to start here is with a meeting earlier this year with Albie Sachs. And Albie Sachs, if you don't know his work, he's the author of the new South African Constitution after the freedom elections in South Africa. To get to the point where he could write that constitution, he'd been blown up once by the Secret Service in South Africa. He had been shot at, he'd had to escape to the UK, and then eventually, upon freedom, went back to write that constitution. And he very much emphasized, when we were sitting over dinner talking about that journey, that when you write a new constitution, you need to build it from the old history. And he showed me pictures of the South African constitutional courts, which are built from the bricks of the old constitutional courts and the bricks that they added to build the new constitutional courts. And he said that a proper revolutionary imagination takes the best bits of an old history and reinvents them and reimagineers them for the future. And we've heard today about creative imagination, we've heard about entrepreneurial imagination, and I think grasping at a time of complexity and change and pace, a revolutionary imagination is important, because in revolutionary activities such as Mandela and Albie Sachs processed, you're having to mobilize across sectors with scarce resources to make amazing things happen in the face of great odds. Because sometimes, doesn't it, sometimes it feels too fast for us to think with our complex competing speeds between our commercial activity, our tech at space, our government bodies moving slowly, a brilliant business deal sitting right in front of you, and you can't land it because there's a visa blockage somewhere in an African nation. The diverse and multiple horizons that we have to hold together, and the pressing new scapes through which we have to try and imagine and analyze, the technoscapes, the finance-scapes, the media-scapes that misreports us or reports us well, the ethnoscapes of the diversities of the planet and the diasporas that we engage with, and the competing ideas. And we can encounter this pace with excitement, but with frustration, and somehow as leaders and as managers, we have to kind of hold it all together in our head. And sometimes that's busting, isn't it? So how can we recombine when it's almost too fast to think? Well, it seems to me that one of the ways that we can do that is to reflect anew and to try and find out what's happening out there in the world. And so with some colleagues, we've been out interviewing entrepreneurs, we've been out interviewing government bodies that are trying to refashion their global trajectory, and we've been out interviewing those that want to start again. And corporates tell us that they're becoming increasingly de-spaced, which is to say they're stretching along global supply chains and they're thinking less and less of where they are seated, to quote the speaker just before lunch. But ironically, they're doing that just as some fast emerging sectors like hydrogen and those that rely on green growth require an element of local scale to be able to get over the margin challenges that those startup and those growth sectors need. And as a result, if you sit with BP or lots of other global corporates, they'll talk to us in terms of country, city, corporate interchangeably, because they're thinking of place and nation, city and large corporate almost in the same breath, to seek how they work separately and to seek how they work together. So we've been out on a research journey trying to make sense of this space, and we found some pioneers. And so what I'm going to reflect on very briefly today is those pioneers, not by giving you a roadmap, but by asking the question of how we re-anchor and we reboot where we're seated and where we want to belong to and where we want to challenge to. And I want to do that in such a way that you think not just in terms of this is a Pakistani case study or this is a UK case study or an American case study, but what was the way that these case studies, what was the way that these people thinking about, how were they imagining in a revolutionary fashion when they went about these things, so that when we start thinking about Pakistan again, we can think about some of our existing assets in fresh ways. So don't forget the mosque, don't forget the new buildings in Karachi that are there, and don't forget talented people such as Asghar Zaidi, who've chosen to come back to Pakistan from stellar global careers in academia, for example, to run Government College, Lahore. Where do we belong and how do we build the anchors? So firstly, how do we recalibrate local advantage? Let's just give you one example. The Thames Estuary. The City of London gets a lot of highlights. The region of London gets highlights. The Thames Estuary area is the 22 local government areas that stretches from the east of London, which has a very significant Pakistani and Bengali diaspora community, going out to the coastal communities to the east of London. It's got 9 airports and seaports. It's got huge brownfield sites, strong research institutions, outstanding natural beauty and wildlife, ports and logistics sector generating already over 2.5 billion, and a proximity to London as a hub. But it hasn't really been thought of in UK government as even a region, let alone a powerhouse that might be seeking to connect globally. Now, why do I flag this? Because by remapping the estuary as a region, the Estuary Growth Board has been able to establish that there are a series of potential hydrogen clusters. And each of those hydrogen clusters on their own mean nothing. Potential hydrogen clusters because of usages of existing power, whether that's oil or gas or electricity or whatever. But each of them on their own is too micro to be able to make the case for enough scale. But by mapping the estuary area as a distinct economic geography, the recombination of those clusters makes the case for a large-scale hydrogen sector that's investable and has the potential with some element of government subsidy to start making margins. And if you start mapping UK, if you start mapping up other geographies, the usages of power are such that the recombination of clusters of usage make a strong and relatively solid margin case for hydrogen at scale in other estuary areas, in other localities. Now, why is the collaboration to make that estuary cluster possible? Is because there's a coming together of private, public, and civil society spaces to be able to address the planning challenges, to be able to unlock better procurement on the part of government, and to be able to procure at scale. And one of the other things that's flowed out of that is a reimagination of the use of the river. Instead of the river as just a flow of water, the river is strategically and intentionally a place that can be used for freight, for unmanned freight, and the opening up or the reopening up of piers and docks along that river that have been shut since the 19th century, so that the city's huge waste, human waste and other waste, can go out along the river, and the 1.5 billion parcels that will enter London next year from Amazon alone can go up the river through another route. This is a private sector-led recombination that's enabled sectors to emerge between public, private and civil collaboration between hydrogen, waterborne, freight, creative, ports and logistics, digital, and also a health sector. And this has unlocked new niches. In October, as a result of this collaboration, New collaborations with Hong Kong, San Francisco and others will lead to a new global Estuaries of the World network looking at shared challenges. And they have two different kinds of challenges: social outcome challenges on aging and the role of tech, and at the other side, really distinct insurance and financial sector needs, because what all these estuary areas have in combination is a problem with rising water levels and no one with an adequate model of risk to be able to insure in that space. So the recombination has created deliberate intentionality on the use of an undersweated asset called the river, and unintentional value adds by the identification of these new niches. And we can then start kind of applying these principles, if we look globally, to how some other undersweated assets can be unlocked. Indiana State has 1,090 foreign-based companies there. English, French, German, Hebrew, Urdu, Hindu, Italian, and other languages are all spoken. Good air connectivity. And so the Indiana Development Corporation has been created by the local government as a public-private partnership, but essentially one that's controlled by the government, to lever in a joint venture with large power companies, a hydrogen footprint for the whole region, and a series of other commercial startup ecosystems around it. You know, what's really distinctive is that that's it's an invested and a revolving fund, so the money that they make gets ploughed back in. It doesn't get taken back to the state centre, it doesn't get creamed off by the local government body. But that secondly, the equivalent of the Minister for Commerce in Indiana State is the CEO of the corporation, and he's measured on his ability to deliver value for that corporation rather than on the number of meetings he attends in the cabinet. In fact, it encourages him to spend less time on politics and more time on building alliances across all of the political parties and all of the stakeholders in society. So Indiana as a case study that's reaching out. In the US, diasporas are the same, highly concentrated, and actually because of their concentration, if one looks at the cash flows between the particular states in the US which have a high African density and their trade with their equivalent African counterparts in sub-Saharan Africa, then the two-way flows of knowledge, skills, and sharing work really well. And the challenge here then for us is when we think of nation, or we think of our firm, do we really think of ourselves as local diplomats, as people recombining talent locally and across the whole of our supply chains in each of the places where they're seated to become representatives, advocates, allies, and recombiners, reimaginary, revolutionary engineers of something new? In Atlanta, we interviewed Coca-Cola. 20% of their global sales are in sub-Saharan Africa. The only institution with bigger reach to sub-Saharan Africa than Coca-Cola, as far as we could map it, was the Chinese government, and yet Coca-Cola in Atlanta did not consider themselves to be a representative of Atlanta or of the United States. A big firm in Karachi, who are you representing, who are you recombining? The same with Denver, where Western Union is headquartered in Denver and has 21,000 outlets, pretty much in Nigeria and in Africa alone. So we can get confused, can't we? Not confused. When we look at the assets that we've got, when we look at the talent that we've got, when we look at the pathways that we got, we forget which assets are present, what talent we've got, and how recombination across public, private, civil can unlock something fresh. And two very quick examples of how this can lead you to a different way of thinking. The Canterbury Medical School, there's now well-evidenced research, and it's very new in place, and it maps research coming out of Harvard, which is that those that come to study there are more likely to found firms there, wherever they come from all over the world. So in the growing, high-powered, elite educational sector in Pakistan as it grows, when you persuade people to come from the Stans, from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, when you persuade them to come from UAE and reverse, these are your allies of the future, your investors of the future. The university is not simply a social cost on society, it's a node point, it's a diplomatic outpoint. And Canterbury Cathedral, we might look at and see that as a religious space. It is a classically religious space, just like that big mosque in here in Islamabad, the one that I started with a picture of. But the educational outreach to school children of the Canterbury Cathedral is such that they educate more people every year passing through their learning courses than the whole of the educational system for the region that it sits in. And the number of external visitors that visit Canterbury means that if you combine the visitor footfall to Canterbury Cathedral with the other visitors to the other cathedrals, you end up with an economic sector just under the size of the airline and aviation or the transport sector in London. And so when one looks back at the mosque and one thinks of the footfall to Mecca, or one thinks of the tourist footfall to the mosques across Pakistan, or to the potential role of the university, or to the outreach through the diaspora or the other firms that we have, do we think of them as social costs? Do we think of them only as charitable objects? Or do we think of them as co-agents in reinvention? And it seems to me that in reinventing that rootedness, we can reinvent and reimagine the collaborations at big scale for how we get to the global territories of the planet. And because global works is about collaboration at every scale. And one of the things that's interesting coming out of our research now is that we're finding regions that aren't in competition collaborating with each other. Thames Estuary collaborating with Detroit on carbon and river freight because they share the same challenges. Indiana and Manchester in the UK on hydrogen because they share the same challenges, but they're not in competition in other regards. 15 US states have military partnerships to share military tech, military knowledge, and the best procurement standards with militaries of nations in other parts of the country. And there's a global alliance of healthy cities, a global alliance of green cities. All of these partners and networks that we've been able to map so far don't yet include any Pakistani actors. And why is that important? It's because Karachi, Islamabad, Lahore, but definitely Lahore and Karachi, they're bigger than any of the places that I'm talking about. Bigger than a country like Rwanda that gets held up as an innovative case study for social change and where I've also been doing research. The undersweated potential in those cities, one imagines, if we're finding it in much smaller places with much more GDP to play with in the first place, is there to be recombined, there to be reinvented, and there with a revolutionary spirit to be set through again. And in recombining those sectors, we're going to be chasing after some of the best behaviours or most effective favours when it comes to government. 3 major governments from 3 countries that we've been talking to, when they go looking for allies in a country like Pakistan, they look local abroad first, not in the embassy. They pitch the innovation from that local region, such as Karachi, back to their national headquarters, and then national headquarters makes it the diplomatic priority back here. So if you're not playing local, then you're not playing global, and that approach mirrors some of the most exceptional successes of the PRC, what some people think of them in their engagement with South America. So reimagination, a revolutionary spirit, sweating all of the assets that we've got, and being proud of where we're seated in order to unlock the best of what we have next to us where we're seated to take us to the whole planet. It's closer than we think. Our times may be too fast to think, but with fresh ways of looking, we can manage those bits that we can get our heads around and the places where we're rooted around through the anchor institutions that we've got. Thanks for listening.